It was our friends just down the hall at TSN who first introduced us to Jonathan Pitre when they featured him in the documentary The Butterfly Child back in 2015, chronicling his daily life and struggles.
It's always pushing me to my limits, and it's always pushing me past my limits.
TSN's James Duthie presented that doc and also broke the news of Jonathan's death in an Instagram post this morning. He praised his courage, saying, quote, "He had the toughest life imaginable and yet always saw the positive in it, always found hope through endless pain." And James joins me now from Augusta, Georgia, where he's covering the Masters. James, this is such a sad day for you and so many who loved and were inspired by Jonathan, including all of us in the newsroom here. Tell us about that phone call you received.
Well, it was heartbreaking. He hadn't been doing well. The tragic part is, Lisa, back in January around Christmas time, he'd really started to make some progress. His skin was healing after he had this stem cell transplant with his mother. He'd been down in Minnesota. The first one had failed, but the second one had worked. And you heard in his voice real hope. He was talking about making plans to come home. They'd been down there for almost 2 years. And it was the most optimistic he'd sound. He was always an optimistic kid, but it was the most optimistic he'd sounded in a while. And then things took a turn. And the last time I visited with him was in early February. And he just had a couple of setbacks. And it's funny, he tried to still stay so positive and, you know, I'm going to pull through this and keep fighting. But I could see that, you know, it's tiring, I think, exhausting to fight that fight for so long as he did. And so the only piece we take in today, I think, is that the pain is over for him, because this is a kid who lived in severe pain from the day he was born to the day he passed.
You know, that is exactly what I've been thinking, James. You know, through the sadness of losing such a remarkable boy, it is the fact that he is no longer in pain, what must have been excruciating pain. And Tina, his mom, has been such a warrior through all of this. So often it kind of seemed that Jonathan was still the boss.
He was. You know, what she did, and I hope that doesn't get forgotten in this, Jonathan deserves all the attention that he should get, because he was just such an amazing kid and such a courageous kid. But what his mom did for him was basically sacrifice her entire life. She never had a day off, never had a vacation. Anybody who knows Jonathan's story, to give him that bath she had to give him every 2 days and go through, his entire body was cut and bruised, and to have to bathe him and then wrap him basically from head to toe and watch her son in excruciating pain like that, I can't even fathom that. And it's funny, I want to get hokey, but how people choose each other somehow. She was the toughest mother I've ever seen. He's the most courageous kid I've ever seen. I kind of think only two people like that could get through this for 17 years.
Wow, you had a special relationship with him also, though. How did you first meet?
Well, I got an email from my sister one night. I guess it's 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and the Ottawa Citizen had done the first story. Andrew Duffy did a terrific job. And I sat there, it was a Saturday night at home watching hockey, and had tears in my eyes reading the story about Jonathan. And at the very end of the story, there was one line that said he dreamed of being a sportscaster. And right away I said, you know, we have to do something for this kid, and reached out for the family. And it was a month later that he was down at TSN. And I met him in person the same night you met him in person, because I remember bringing him into the studio to meet you. And I know you saw what I saw right away. Take the disease away for a second. This was an amazing kid who had that light in his eyes. It was like talking to a 75-year-old wise grandfather. The old soul who was funny and self-deprecating and looked you in the eye and asked you questions. It wasn't your normal 14-year-old. And then you put on top of that what he'd been through his entire life. And to never have a single moment of self-pity, to always be positive in the face of this just unimaginable pain that he had to go through every single day. He's just one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met in my life.
You said in your post that he was an old soul. and also how positive he always was. Having known him, where did he find that strength to be so positive in the face of such constant pain, do you think?
I don't know. Maybe from Tina, maybe from his mom, or maybe he just had it within him. I don't know how you could possibly find that. It was extraordinary. I don't think people will ever understand, even though they've seen the pictures or watched the documentary, to imagine that on a day-to-day basis. And maybe you have no other choice. I'm sure Jonathan isn't the only courageous kid with EB or one of those diseases. But the only thing that really brings, I hope, peace to Tina and to myself and everybody that knows Jonathan is that he really found a purpose in those last few years. You know, they were very private for the first 14 years of his life. And then when they made the decision to tell the story, first to the Ottawa Citizen, then to us and to the world, that's a very brave decision to put yourself out there like that, to show exactly what EB is like, because that's the only way they could do it, to show those awful pictures, those painful pictures, and what he goes through on a day-to-day basis. And he never wanted celebrity or attention from all this. He got to do a lot of really cool stuff because he became well-known, got to meet a lot of hockey players, go to the NHL awards, drive a race car, all these things. But he really didn't care about that. He didn't even get that much of a charge out of it. What really made him proud was to be able to draw attention to the disease, to raise money for it, to educate people about a disease that nobody really knew anything about except the families that were living with it. And I'm thrilled that he got to do that in his last few years, because it really gave him purpose. And I think that brought him a lot of peace in his last months.
You know, you just reminded me of that incredibly touching moment when the documentary won the Canadian Screen Award, and you brought Jonathan on stage to accept it. And I wondered if, you know, all that notoriety ever went to his head, or if in fact he saw himself as an activist.
I think he saw himself as an activist, but nothing ever went to his head whatsoever. He never changed a single little bit. He was the most polite, nicest kid that you would ever meet. And in meeting huge celebrities and hockey players, stuff that would make us all starstruck. That's the other thing with Johnny. He never really got starstruck. When we had him on TSN that first night on the panel, he was calm, was cool. He could have done it for a living. He was so good. He analyzed the hockey game, and you know, even meeting people like Sidney Crosby, who, you know, an untold story, when he got to go on the NHL awards, Sid found out about it and had a suit made for him from the guy who makes Sidney's suits. Because, Jonathan never had a suit, of course, and obviously with his frail body, a very tough thing to make. And Sidney paid for that just so he could put a suit on for the first time in his life and wear it on stage like the hockey players did. So the fact that he got all those moments and, I'm really proud of the fact you're doing this and his story's being told today and the Prime Minister tweeting about it. I think even though that stuff, the notoriety wouldn't matter to Jonathan, I think he'd be really proud, because when people are talking about him, they're talking about EB.
Right, and that's the key.
All he really wanted.
Yeah, that's the key. Now, going forward, how can Jonathan's legacy help others and stay alive?
Well, I guess that's up to us and up to everybody who met him to not forget that there are other children that suffer with this horrible disease. And I think he's already done that. I think he cemented that in the money that he's raised, and the fact that, I've heard from countless people today that say they'll never forget him, which is something we always say when somebody passes, but I think they really mean it with Jonathan. I had people compare him to Terry Fox, and I know it's a completely different scale what Terry did, but just in the sense of the inspiration. And I think that's a fair comparison there. He inspired us with what he did and with his courage, and that's an unbelievable gift that he gave to all of us.
Well, I want to thank you, James, because I know that he meant a lot to you and so many others, but to speak to us today when, you're in the middle of a big story. So thank you so much for this tonight.
No, thank you, Lisa, and thank you for talking about Jonathan and keeping his story alive.
Our hearts certainly go out to Tina and the family for raising such a brave and beautiful boy.